My name is Renee Calloway. I'm 43 years old. And I found out my father had a whole other life, a whole other family. At the exact moment he was no longer alive to explain himself. The will reading was scheduled for a Tuesday, 11 in the morning. My father's attorney, a man named Gerald Fitch, had an office on the fourth floor of a building in downtown Columbus, Ohio. The kind of office with dark wood paneling and framed diplomas arranged in a way that's supposed to make you feel like everything is under control. I remember the carpet was burgundy. I remember there was a clock on the wall that ticked louder than seemed necessary. I remember thinking my black blazer was too tight across the shoulders and wondering, absurdly, if I'd gained weight from stress eating since the funeral. I was not prepared for what was already sitting in the room when I arrived. There was a woman I had never seen before, maybe 55, with silver streaked hair pulled back neatly and her hands folded in her lap like she was waiting for a church service to begin. Next to her sat a young man, maybe 28, 29, in a dark suit that looked like it had been purchased specifically for this occasion. He had my father's jaw. He had my father's cans. Long fingers, slightly squared off at the tips. The same hands that had helped me learn to ride a bike in the parking lot of Westland Elementary School when I was 7 years old. I stood in the doorway of that office for what felt like a full minute before Gerald Fitch cleared his throat and said, "Miss Calloway, please come in. Everyone is here now. Everyone." I sat down. I did not ask who these people were. Some part of my brain, the part that had been running on funeral adrenaline and casserole dishes from neighbors and the mechanical business of burying a parent, simply refused to process what my eyes were already telling me. I opened my leather folio. I clicked my pen. I looked down at the blank notepad inside like I was about to take minutes at a business meeting, as if this were ordinary, as if the man next to me didn't have my father's hands. Gerald Fitch introduced them formally. The woman's name was Darlene Pruitt. The young man was Marcus Pruitt Calloway. Pruitt Calloway. My father's name was Robert Allen Calloway. Gerald Fitch continued speaking. His voice became a low, distant sound, like a radio playing in another room. I heard the word beneficiary. I heard primary residence. I heard the sum total of liquid assets, retirement accounts, and personal property to be transferred in full, and then he said an address I didn't recognize, somewhere in Gahanna, a suburb 20 minutes from the house where I grew up, the house where my mother died, the house where my mother died, the house I had assumed, apparently foolishly, apparently naively, was my inheritance. I looked up from my notepad. Marcus Pruitt Calloway was looking at the table. Darlene was looking at Gerald Fitch, nodding slowly like a woman hearing news she had been expecting for a long time. And I understood in one terrible and clarifying second that I was the only person in that room who didn't already know the shape of this story. My father, Robert Allen Talloway, retired civil engineer, Sunday morning pancake maker, man who slow danced with my mother at their 35th anniversary party and cried when he thought no one was watching, had maintained a second family for at least 29 years, had a son, had a woman he apparently loved enough to build a quiet parallel life with in a suburb 20 minutes away, close enough to visit easily, far enough that you'd never run into anyone who knew you. I had been his daughter for 43 years. Marcus had apparently been his son for 29. And somewhere in the last months of my father's life, he died of pancreatic cancer, quickly, the way that disease moves. He had decided, deliberately and in writing, that Marcus and Darlene were the family that mattered. The house in Gahanna, the $340,000 in retirement savings, the investment account he'd been quietly building since the 90s. The house I grew up in had a small mortgage remaining. He left instructions for it to be sold. My share of the proceeds after the mortgage was settled came to roughly $19,000. $19,000 for 43 years of being Robert Calloway's daughter. I did not cry in Gerald Fitch's office. I want you to know that. I sat in that burgundy carpeted room with the ticking clock, and I listened to every word until it was finished. And then I stood up and I put on my coat and I thanked Gerald Fitch for his time in a voice I barely recognized as my own. In the elevator going down, I stared at the closed metal doors and thought about my father's hands. How I had held them in that hospital room in his final week. How he had looked at me and said, "Renee, I love you. I need you to know that." I had believed him. What I didn't understand yet, what I would spend the next 4 months uncovering, piece by piece, document by document, was that the story wasn't over. That my father, in his secret life, had not only hidden a family, he had hidden something else. Something that, once I found it, would change everything that happened in that office. Something that would bring Marcus Pruitt Calloway and Darlene to a very different table in a very different room for a very different kind of conversation. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about my father first, the one I thought I knew. My father was the kind of man people described as steady. That was always the word. At his funeral, three different people used it without knowing the others had. His college roommate from Ohio State, his neighbor of 22 years, Don Herrera. Even the pastor who had only known him 6 months somehow landed on it in the eulogy. Robert Calloway was a steady man, reliable, present, the kind of man who showed up. I had built my entire understanding of myself on that foundation. I grew up in Hilliard, Ohio, in a house on Brayburn Court with a basketball hoop in the driveway that listed slightly to the left because my dad installed it himself on a Saturday in 1989 and refused to admit he'd measured wrong. My mother, Carol, taught fourth grade for 31 years. She made her own pie crusts. She kept a running list of library books she wanted to read on a yellow legal pad on the kitchen counter, and when she died of a stroke in 2017, the list still had 11 titles on it that she never got to. I think about that list more than I probably should. My parents were not a perfect couple. They argued about money, about my mother's family, about the temperature of the house in winter. My father worked long hours when I was young, civil engineering projects that took him to different counties, sometimes overnight. I remember my mother being quietly unhappy about it in the way women of her generation were trained to be contained, private, choosing her battles. But they loved each other. Or at least I believed they did. I still believe my mother did. I am no longer certain what my father was doing. I was an only child, or I believed I was. That single fact reorganizes itself in my memory now like a photograph developing in reverse. Every memory I have of being my father's only daughter now carries a shadow in it I didn't know was there. Every birthday where he was present, every school play he attended, every Sunday drive where it was just the three of us. Where was he the Sundays he wasn't there? I used to think, work, or fishing with Dawn from next door, or the quiet, ordinary errands that fill a man's weekend. I don't think that anymore. I moved back to Hilliard in 2019. My marriage to a man named Patrick had ended the year before. Amicably, no children, just two people who had grown in directions that didn't overlap anymore. I was 40 years old, freshly single, working remotely as a technical writer for a healthcare software company, and my father had just been diagnosed with early stage type 2 diabetes and was managing it badly. He wasn't testing his blood sugar consistently. He was still eating the way he'd eaten in 1987. He had a stubbornness about his own health that I recognized from childhood, a kind of deliberate incuriosity about bad news, as if not measuring a thing meant it wasn't happening. I found a rental house 4 miles from Brayburn Court, and I reorganized my life around being nearby. I want to be clear about something. Nobody asked me to do this. My father didn't ask. There were no siblings to negotiate with, no family meeting where responsibilities were divided. I did it because he was my father and he was alone. My mother had been gone 2 years by then, and because I'm the kind of woman who, when she sees something that needs doing, does it. I don't say that with pride exactly. I say it because I think it's important to understand who I am and who I was when all of this began. For 3 years, I was at that house on Brayburn Court too, sometimes 3 times a week. I drove him to appointments. I organized his medications, the metformin, then later the blood pressure pills, eventually the insulin, into one of those weekly pill organizers that he found embarrassing and I insisted on anyway. I took him to his eye doctor, his podiatrist, his cardiologist. When the pancreatic cancer appeared in January of 2022, I was the one sitting across from the oncologist taking notes on my phone because my father's face had gone completely blank in the way faces do when they receive information too large to hold. During all of this, every appointment, every pharmacy run, every Tuesday night dinner at his kitchen table, my father was warm with me. He was grateful. He told me I was the best thing he'd ever done. He said it enough times that I wrote it down once in my journal because I wanted to remember it. He also, I now understand, had a son 20 minutes away who he was probably seeing on the Sundays he said he was fishing. The first warning sign I dismissed came about 8 months before he died. I had gone to Brayburn Court on a Wednesday afternoon to bring groceries and found him in the living room on a phone call that he ended very quickly when I walked in. Too quickly. He said it was his financial advisor. I had no reason to question it. He had a financial advisor, a man named Todd something. I'd met him once at a dinner years ago. I put the groceries away and we watched the news and I drove home. The second sign came 6 weeks later. I was helping him organize some paperwork. He'd gotten behind on filing, and I'd offered to help sort it. And I found a bank statement for an account I didn't recognize. Not his primary checking, not the savings account I knew about. A different bank entirely. The statement was only a partial page, and the balance visible was just under $12,000. I asked him about it. He said it was an old account he was closing out. Barely anything in it not worth discussing. I believed him. I filed the partial statement in a folder labeled miscellaneous and moved on. I am not a foolish woman. I want to say that plainly. I am not someone who ignores things because she is naive. I ignored those things because I loved my father and because the alternative, the thing those details were quietly pointing toward, was so far outside what I understood my life to be that my brain simply would not construct it. There are things the mind refuses to see, not because it can't, but because seeing them would require dismantling everything built on top of them. I was not ready to dismantle anything. Not yet. My father died on a Thursday morning in March. I was there. I held his hand. He said my name twice near the end, very quietly, and I told him I loved him and that it was okay to go. 8 days later, I walked into Gerald Fitch's office and found out who else he had said goodbye to before he got to me. I gave myself exactly 4 days after the will reading before I did anything at all. This was not weakness. This was strategy, though I didn't fully recognize it as such at the time. I went home to my rental house on Delwood Avenue. I changed out of my black blazer. I made a pot of coffee I didn't drink, and I sat at my kitchen table for a very long time looking at nothing. My cat, a gray tabby named Herschel, jumped into my lap and stayed there for 2 hours without moving, the way animals do when they sense something has broken in the room. I didn't cry until the second night. And when I did, it wasn't the elegant cinematic kind of grief. It was the ugly, airless kind, the kind that has no bottom to it. Where you're not sure if you're crying for your father or for your mother or for the version of your childhood that had just been quietly retired without your consent. On the fifth day, I called my best friend, Claudette Morris. Claudette and I have known each other since the seventh grade. She lives in Worthington now, teaches occupational therapy at Ohio State, and is the kind of person who, when you call her with news that would make most people gasp and fumble for words, goes very quiet for a moment and then says, "Okay, tell me everything. Start from the beginning." I told her everything: the office, the burgundy carpet, the clock, Darlene's folded hands, Marcus and his father's jaw, the number $19,000 spoken aloud in a room where it was supposed to represent the sum of my inheritance. Claudette was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Renee, that partial bank statement you found, where is it?" I had to think. In a folder? In a box I brought back from Dad's house after he died. "Don't touch anything in that box," she said, "and call a probate attorney. Not Gerald Fitch, someone who represents you." That was the first useful thought I'd had in 5 days, and it came from someone else. I wrote it down. But before I found an attorney, something happened that I had not anticipated. 3 days after my conversation with Claudette, my phone rang. The number was local but unfamiliar. I almost didn't answer. It was Marcus. His voice was lower than I expected, measured, careful, like someone who had rehearsed the opening of a conversation several times and was now executing it. He said he understood this must be a shock. He said he hadn't known about me either, not until about a year before our father died. He said he thought maybe we should meet, talk, that he had questions too. I stood in my kitchen holding the phone and staring at the window above the sink, and I thought about every possible response. I chose the most honest one. I said, "I need some time before I can have that conversation." He said he understood. He gave me his number, which I already had from the caller ID. We hung up. I stood there for another 5 minutes before I realized my hand was shaking. I want to tell you something about Marcus Pruitt Calloway, based on that phone call and everything that came after. He was not my enemy. I knew that even then, even in the rawest part of the wound, I understood that he was as much a product of my father's choices as I was, just shaped differently by them. He had grown up knowing his father part time, fitting himself into the gaps of a man's schedule, probably learning not to ask too many questions about where Robert Calloway went on Sunday evenings. That is its own kind of damage. I won't minimize it, but he had also been handed everything. And I'd been handed $19,000 in a folder labeled miscellaneous. That asymmetry required addressing. I found my attorney through a referral from a colleague, a probate and estate litigation specialist named Diane Okafor, whose office was in a glass building near the Short North in Columbus. She was 50, direct, and had the particular energy of a woman who has spent 2 decades watching families destroy each other over money and has lost her capacity for surprise, but not her capacity for outrage. She reviewed what I had in our first meeting: the will, documentation Gerald Fitch had provided, the partial bank statement, a list of everything I could remember about my father's finances from 3 years of managing his care. And she looked up at me over her reading glasses and said, "Tell me about the caregiving. Every appointment, every expense you covered out of pocket. Do you have records?" I had records. I had records because I am a technical writer by profession, and documentation is not something I do casually. It is something I do the way other people breathe. I had a folder on my laptop going back to 2019. Appointment dates, mealage logs, pharmacy receipts I'd photographed and emailed to myself, a spreadsheet of out of pocket expenses I had covered and never been reimbursed for, totaling a number I had never added up all at once because doing so felt mercenary while he was alive. Diana Okafor looked at the spreadsheet for a long moment. "This is a start," she said, "but I want to look at something else first. That account you found the statement for, I want to know what was in it and where it went in the last 18 months of his life." I told her I'd bring her the folder. What I didn't tell her yet, because I hadn't fully processed it myself, was that 2 nights earlier, going through that box from Brever and Court, I had found something else tucked behind the miscellaneous folder: an envelope. Inside the envelope were 3 years of statements for that secondary account, not a partial page, complete statements bundled together with a rubber band, as if my father had meant to deal with them and kept not dealing with them and kept not dealing with them. The account had held, at its peak, just over $218,000. By the time my father died, it held $4,200. I did not know yet where $213,800 had gone, but I had 3 years of statements that would tell me, transaction by transaction, if I was willing to look. I was willing to look. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with Herschel on the chair beside me, and I began going through every line. It took 4 hours. By the end, my coffee was cold, my eyes hurt, and I had a legal pad with 11 pages of notes in my handwriting. And I knew exactly where the money had gone. There is a particular kind of clarity that arrives after the worst thing has already happened. I have heard people describe it as going numb, but that was never quite right for what I experienced sitting at that kitchen table at 2 in the morning with 11 pages of notes and a cold cup of coffee. It wasn't numbness, it was precision. Like every soft and hoping part of me had stepped quietly aside to make room for something harder and more capable. A version of myself I hadn't needed before. I looked at what I had found and I did not cry. I made a list. The secondary account, held at a regional bank called Midwest Cornerstone, which I had never heard my father mention once in 43 years, had been opened in 2001. I want you to sit with that number for a moment. 2001. I was 22 years old in 2001, finishing my last year at Ohio University, calling my father on Sunday evenings from a dorm room in Athens. He had been maintaining that account, quietly and in parallel, for over 20 years. The deposits were regular and modest in the early years: 200 here, 500 there. The kind of amounts that disappear into the background noise of a household budget without drawing attention. But beginning in 2019, the same year I moved back to Hilliard to help care for him, the withdrawals became significant, and they followed a pattern. Every month, between the 15th and the 20th, a transfer went out. The amounts varied, sometimes $4,000, sometimes $6,500. Once in March of 2021, $11,000 in a single transfer. But the destination account number was always the same. I had no name attached to that account number from the statements alone, but Diane Okafor would. Beyond the monthly transfers, there were other transactions that stopped me cold. In November of 2020, a withdrawal of $22,000 described only as cashier's check. In April of 2021, another cashier's check, this one for 18,000. And in August of 2021, 7 months before my father's cancer diagnosis, 5 months before I drove him to the appointment where we first heard the word oncologist, a final cashier's check for $31,000. $71,000 in cashier's checks over 14 months, on top of the regular monthly transfers, all moving out of an account my father had kept hidden for 2 decades. I thought about the Sundays he said he was fishing. I thought about the partial statement I had found, filed without question into a folder, because I had loved and trusted him. I thought about sitting in that hospital room holding his hand, telling him it was okay to go. And then I put those thoughts away because there was work to do. I was at Diane Okafor's office by 8:30 the next morning with the complete bank statements in a manila envelope and my 11 pages of notes. I watched her read through them the way I imagine surgeons look at scans, focused, unhurried, already thinking 3 steps ahead of what she was seeing. When she finished, she set the papers down and folded her hands on her desk. She said, "Renee, I need to ask you something directly. When your father was receiving medical care in the last 2 years of his life, during chemo, during the periods when his cognition was affected by treatment, who was managing his finances?" I told her mostly himself, with my help on the organizational side. I paid bills with him present. I never had power of attorney, he had never offered it, and I had never pushed, because it felt presumptuous while he was still lucid. She nodded slowly. "And Darlene Pruitt, do you know if she had any legal authority over his accounts?" I didn't know. I told her I didn't know. "That's what I'm going to find out," she said. "Because these transfer amounts and these cashier's checks, if she was named on that account, or if she had power of attorney at any point, we need to establish that. And if she wasn't," she paused, "if she wasn't, then someone was directing significant assets out of an account your father may not have had full capacity to manage in his final months. And that is a conversation for more than just probate court." She said the word more in a way that required no elaboration. I drove home and I did the thing Claudette had told me to do 3 weeks earlier and I hadn't fully done yet. I went back through every document I had brought from Braeburn Court and I looked at everything. Not just the financial papers, everything. In a shoebox on the top shelf of my father's bedroom closet, a shoebox I had moved twice without opening because it was taped shut and labeled tax records 2009 in my father's handwriting, I found a document that rearranged the entire picture. It was a warranty deed, dated September 14th, 2018, 3 years before my father's cancer diagnosis, 1 year before I moved back to Hilliard to care for him. The property listed was a house in Guyana, Ohio. The address was the one Gerald Fitch had read aloud in that burgundy carpeted office as the primary asset of my father's estate. The deed listed 2 owners, Robert Allen Calloway and Darlene Ann Pruitt, joint tenancy with right of survivorship. I had to read that phrase 3 times before my legal knowledge, limited but not non existent, gleaned from years of writing documentation for healthcare compliance, caught up with what I was looking at. Joint tenancy with right of survivorship means that when one owner dies, the property transfers automatically and immediately to the surviving owner. It does not pass through the will. It does not go through probate. It simply transfers by operation of law the moment death is recorded. My father had not left that house to Darlene and Marcus through his will. He had structured the ownership so that Darlene received it before the will ever became relevant, which meant Gerald Fitch had not been managing a straightforward estate distribution. He had been presiding over what remained after the most significant asset had already been legally removed from the equation. I photographed the deed with my phone. I'd put it back in the shoebox. I sat on the edge of my father's bed in the quiet of a house that smelled like him still like cedar and coffee and the particular soap he'd used my entire life. And I let myself feel, for exactly 10 minutes, everything I had been setting aside to make room for precision. Then I texted Diane Okafor a photograph of the warranty deed and wrote, "Found this. Call me when you can." She called within the hour. Her voice had a different quality than it had in our meetings, sharper, more energized, the sound of a woman who has just seen the shape of an argument she knows how to make. She said, "Renee, I want you to listen carefully. The deed is significant, but it's not the center of this. The center of this is that secondary account, the transfer pattern, and the cashier's checks. I've had a colleague run the destination account number from the statements. The receiving account is held jointly by Darlene Pruitt and Marcus Pruitt Calloway. And some of those transfers, the largest ones in the final year of your father's life, occurred after his first round of chemotherapy, when his oncologist's notes document significant cognitive fatigue. I was quiet. What I'm telling you, Diane said, is that we may have the basis for a claim of undue influence over a vulnerable adult. That is not a probate dispute. That is potentially a matter for the state. Outside my father's bedroom window, a neighbor's dog was barking at something in the yard next door. The ordinary sound of an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio. Inside the room, everything was about to become something different. What do I need to do? I asked. Nothing yet, Diane said. I'm going to make some calls. I need you to sit on this for 2 weeks and not contact Darlene or Marcus. Not a word. Can you do that? I thought about Marcus's phone call, his measured, rehearsed voice. I thought maybe we should meet, talk. Yes, I said, I can do that. I set the phone down on my father's nightstand, the same nightstand where his pill organizer still sat, the one he'd found embarrassing, the one I had insisted on anyway, and I looked at it for a long moment. Then I stood up, walked to the kitchen, and began making dinner, because there was nothing left to do that night but wait. And I had become, without entirely meaning to, a woman who was very good at waiting. The meeting Diane had in mind was 3 weeks away. The room would not have burgundy carpet, there would be no ticking clock on the wall, but everyone who needed to be there would be there. The meeting was held on a Wednesday morning in early July, 4 months after the will reading, in a conference room on the sixth floor of a building in downtown Columbus that housed the offices of Diane Okafor and three of her colleagues. The room had floor to ceiling windows that looked out over the Scioto River. The sky was the particular shade of pale blue that only exists in the Midwest in early summer, clean and wide and indifferent to everything happening beneath it. Darlene Pruitt arrived with her own attorney, a man named Barrett Hollins, who had the careful, contained energy of someone who had reviewed the situation and was not entirely comfortable with what he'd found. Marcus came with her. He was wearing the same dark suit from Gerald Fitch's office, or one exactly like it. He looked younger than I remembered and more tired. He did not make eye contact with me when he sat down. I had arrived 20 minutes early. I was wearing a navy blazer that fit correctly. I had a bottle of water, my legal pad, and nothing else on the table in front of me. Claudette had offered to come and sit in the hallway outside the conference room just to be a presence nearby. I had let her. Diane opened the meeting with the procedural efficiency of someone who does not believe in preamble. She laid out document by document everything we had assembled over the preceding 4 months. The Midwest Cornerstone account statements, complete and sequential, covering 22 years of quiet parallel financial activity. The transfer pattern. Monthly, consistent, escalating to the joint account held by Darlene and Marcus, the three cashier's checks totaling $71,000. The dates of those checks cross reference against my father's oncology records, which documented, in clinical and unambiguous language, the cognitive effects of his chemotherapy treatment during the periods in question. The warranty deed, pulled from a shoebox labeled Tax Records 2009, establishing that the Gahana property had been placed in joint tenancy 3 years before my father's diagnosis, removing it from probate entirely. And then, the piece Diane had saved for last, the piece her colleague had spent 6 weeks carefully establishing, a notarized power of attorney document executed in November of 2020, naming Darling Ann Pruitt as my father's financial agent. November 2020, the same month as the first $22,000 cashier's check. I had not known about the power of attorney until Diane found it. My father had never mentioned it. It had not been among the documents Gerald Fitch presented at the will reading. It had been executed quietly at a UPS store notary in Gajana, witnessed by two people whose names I did not recognize, during a month when my father had just completed his second round of diagnostic testing and was, according to his own medical records, experiencing what his oncologist described as notable difficulty with complex decision making and executive function. Barrett Holland shifted in his chair when Diane laid that document on the table. Darlene's hands, which had been folded in her lap the way they were in Gerald Fitch's office, unfolded. Diane said, in the same even and unhurried tone she had used for everything else, "We are not here today to litigate grief. We are not here to make moral judgments about choices made decades ago by a man who is no longer alive to account for them. We are here because the financial record indicates that a power of attorney granted to Ms. Pruitt during a period of documented cognitive impairment was used to direct significant assets that would otherwise have formed part of the estate, to accounts held jointly by Ms. Pruitt and her son. We believe this constitutes undue influence over a vulnerable adult under Ohio Revised Code Section 237.7.201, and we are prepared to file accordingly. She paused. We are also prepared not to file, contingent on a conversation that I think everyone in this room is capable of having. Barrett Hollins asked for a 10-minute recess. Diane granted it pleasantly. Marcus and Darlene and their attorney moved to a smaller room down the hall. I stayed at the conference table and looked out at the Scioto River and the pale blue sky, and I thought, with unexpected calm, about my mother's library list on the yellow legal pad. 11 books she never got to read. I thought I might read them. I thought that was something I could do. The recess was 17 minutes. When they came back, Baird Hollins set a yellow legal pad of his own on the table. I noticed this detail and found it either ironic or fitting and couldn't decide which, and he began talking. What was negotiated in that conference room over the following 2 hours is not something I will detail entirely, partly for legal reasons and partly because the specific numbers are not the point of the story. What I will tell you is this: the cashier's check transactions totaling $71,000 were addressed. A portion of the liquid assets from the secondary account were addressed. The $19,000 from the sale of the Braeburn courthouse was rendered moot by what replaced it. The Guyana property, the house my father had purchased and titled in joint tenancy, the house that had passed automatically to Darlene at his death, that remained hers. Diane had been clear-eyed with me about this from the beginning. Joint tenancy with right of survivorship is structurally resistant to challenge unless fraud in the original execution can be proven, and we could not prove that. My father had been legally competent in 2018. He had made that choice with full capacity. I made my peace with that, or I began to. What I had not made peace with, and what the meeting did not resolve, was Marcus. He spoke once during the 2 hours near the end, when the room had quieted into the particular silence that follows the conclusion of formal negotiation. He looked up from the table, and he looked at me directly for the first time since Gerald Fitch's office. And he said, "I didn't know he was going to do it this way. The will. I want you to know that." I looked at him for a moment, at my father's jaw and my father's hands, and the tired face of a man who had spent his life in the margins of someone else's family, shaped by a different set of absences than the ones that had shaped me. I said, "I believe you." And I did. That was the complicated and uncomfortable truth of it. Marcus Pruitt Calloway had not designed this situation any more than I had. He had simply been born into it, the way I had, and our father had spent 29 years managing the distance between us with the careful, deliberate attention he apparently could not manage to give to honesty. We did not hug. We did not exchange numbers again, but something passed between us in that moment that I have never quite found the right word for. Recognition, maybe, the acknowledgement of a shared wound wearing two completely different faces. I walked out of that building at noon. Claudette was sitting in the lobby with 2 cups of coffee from the place across the street. She handed me one and looked at my face and said, "Well?" I said, "It's done." She nodded. We walked out into the July sunlight and stood on the sidewalk and drank our coffee and didn't say anything else for a while, because there was nothing that needed saying that the morning hadn't already said. That was 14 months ago now. I still live on Delwood Avenue. Herschel is still the most emotionally perceptive creature I have ever shared a home with. I finished the technical writing project I'd let slide during those 4 months of documents and attorney calls and sleepless nights, and I took on 2 new clients and gave myself a raise that I had been postponing for reasons I no longer find convincing. I read 4 of the 11 books on my mother's library list. I have 7 left. I'm in no hurry. The Bravery Courthouse sold in September to a young couple with a toddler and another baby on the way. I drove past it once, a few weeks after the sale closed, and sat in my car in front of it for a few minutes. The basketball hoop was still in the driveway, still listing slightly to the left. The new owners hadn't taken it down yet. I don't know if they ever will. I found myself hoping they wouldn't. I have not spoken to Darlene Pruitt since that conference room. I have thought about her more than I expected to, and with less anger than I expected to feel. She loved my father. I believe that too, in the same way I believe Marcus when he says he didn't know. My father was apparently a man who inspired a particular quality of love in people, the kind that coexists peacefully with profound omission. I am still working out what that means about him. I expect I will be working it out for a long time. What I know now, 14 months later, is this: the money mattered. I will not pretend it didn't. The financial outcome of those 4 months of documentation and legal strategy gave me something real and concrete and necessary, and I am not ashamed to say so. Women in particular are trained to be ashamed of caring about money in the context of grief, as if acknowledging the financial dimension of a betrayal makes the emotional wound less legitimate. It doesn't. Both things were real. Both things deserve to be addressed. But the money was never actually the center of it. The center of it was a Tuesday morning in a burgundy carpeted office and a man with my father's hands, and the sudden violent reorganization of everything I thought I knew about who I came from and what I was worth to the person who made me. You cannot resolve that in a conference room. You cannot negotiate your way back to the version of your father that existed before the will reading. That man, the steady man, the Sunday pancake maker, the one who cried at his own anniversary party, he is still real. He existed. He loved me. I am certain of that even now, even knowing everything I know. He was also someone else entirely, in a house 20 minutes away, on the Sundays he wasn't fishing. Both of those things are true. Learning to hold two true things that contradict each other, without letting either one cancel the other out, without collapsing into bitterness or into false forgiveness, that is the work. That is the actual work that no attorney can do for you and no settlement can shortcut. I am doing it slowly, imperfectly, on my own terms. If you have ever been handed a version of your own life that you didn't recognize, if you have ever sat in a room and realized that the story you were living in was not the story you thought it was, then you already know that the path forward is not about revenge. It is not even really about justice, though justice helps, and you should pursue it without apology when it is available to you. The path forward is about deciding, deliberately and with full information, who you are going to be now, on the other side of the wound, in the life that remains. My father named me Renee because my mother liked the way it sounded. It means reborn in French. She told me that when I was 9, sitting in the kitchen on Braeburn Court, and I thought it was the most romantic thing I had ever heard. I still think that. I am still here. I am still becoming. And that, in the end, is the only inheritance that was ever entirely mine.